This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good morning and welcome to the Monday Morning Break with Marie. I am really looking forward to talking to Jo Heyman today and discussing why is it important to explore British values in schools.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Good morning and welcome to the Monday Morning Break. And good morning to you, Jo.
Morning, Marie. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for giving up some time on your bank holiday Monday to come and talk about British values.
Of course, it's my pleasure. I'll talk about British values anytime, so very happy to be here.
Brilliant, thank you. So just to introduce you, so Jo Heyman, you're the founder of Learn About Britain, which educates young people, new migrants to the UK and the wider public about British history, citizenship, culture and values. You're also the former chief executive of the PSHE Association. So I think many teachers out there listening will know that and will have used the resources. I know I have. And you're also the managing director of the Holocaust Educational Trust. You've also written 2 books on modern Britain, that's British Voices and British Journey.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. And
I'm the
just
right person.
Yes, and just to sort of introduce us, so I first met you. I joined a training webinar that you did on teaching British fundamental values, and messaged you afterwards to say how great it was and how useful I found it. And then you very kindly came to Inclusion College, where I'm the head teacher, and you did a fantastic session with our students it was about British fundamental values, but it was sort of critical thinking and discussion, and it was just so valuable. Bearing in mind, the students that we have at Inclusion College have SEND needs, and it was just a fantastic session. So thank you again for that.
That was brilliant. I loved it.
Yeah, it was great. So let's start at the top, shall we? So, what are British fundamental values? Could you explain that first?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there are two different things. There's a kind of government definition of what so-called fundamental British values are, which schools have a kind of obligation, statutory obligation to explore with their pupils and students. And then I think there's a kind of wider sense of what British values are. And if it's all right, I'll try to go through sort of both of those. So
yes, please.
you know that when I delivered my sessions on British values, I really want to hear from young people. And as you said, when I visited the Inclusion College, we had a proper discussion. It wasn't just me sort of lecturing young people. We had a kind of conversation, and we had this conversation about them and their values and what it means to them to grow up in Britain today. And I think their sense of values, who they are, what it means to be British, a lot of that came from within themselves, from within their communities, from the local communities, from their faiths, from the sort of culture that they take in, as well as from sort of the kind of national figures like prime minister or government or other sort of political figures. So I think what British values are the values of the British people, that they belong to all of us. They don't belong to one single political party. They don't belong to the people who write statutory guidance. British values belong to the British people, and I think that that's a really important starting point for the kind of society that I want to build, which is about wherever people have come from to be in this country, whatever their faith, whatever their views, they are welcome here. They're equal here. Um, the country belongs to them as much as to anyone else. So the country belongs to all of us equally, and therefore British values must belong to all of us equally as well. So I see British values as the values of the British people. I think there is a sort of linked but separate idea of fundamental British values, which there is a statutory obligation which schools and colleges have to adhere to, that Ofsted monitor, and so on. And as part of that statutory obligation, schools are required to explore concepts of individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance for people of different faiths and beliefs, the rule of law, and democracy. And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about why those sort of values and why not other values. Notions like fairness, which I think is a very sort of British quality or a British value, aren't there. Equality isn't on that list. I think equality is something that's very important to many people in the country. But I do think, however this list has been come up with, and whether it's fundamentally sort of British or whether it's actually refers to the building blocks of a democratic society, or whether you want to talk about human rights, there's actually quite an interesting recipe for a pluralist, multicultural, democratic society in these British values that the government have given us, or in this sort of list of values that the government have given us. And that's really what my programme is about. As you say, I've founded this organisation, Learn About Britain, which educates about history and culture and citizenship. But I think values are a sort of crucial piece in the jigsaw of building a cohesive society when you have got people of different backgrounds and faiths, different beliefs. Obviously, we've got all kinds of different political beliefs within this country. We've got people from all over the world have come to this country and made this place their home. We've got all of the faiths in the world represented in this country, and so what I'm really interested in is how we can have that kind of equal, tolerant society, a place where all of those people can come and be safe and be free, but also have something that kind of binds us together. And for me, the notion of shared values, I think, is really, really important. The notion of us all being free to be able to be the people that we want to be, but that we're going to be respectful of one another as we do it. The idea that there might have to be some limits on our freedoms, rules and laws in place to stop people from harming one another, and that when values clash with one another, that we should have a democratic process for working out what we do. And that is the essence of these fundamental British values that the government asks all schools to explore. And for me, as I say, I think they're a recipe for a successful multicultural society, which is what I want Britain to be.
Thank you for explaining that. I think that distinction that you've talked about, sort of the British values which belong to all of us, and then, as you've said, the fundamental values which has this statutory obligation, and I agree, there potentially are a couple missing from that are really important, and as you said, about building this society where people are safe and welcome and respected, and those shared values. I think that's a really helpful, really important explanation. So I mean, I think you've sort of probably answered this one already, but why is it important to explore British values in school?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think first, as I said, I'm interested in building a cohesive, fair society, and I think you've got to think about those two things together. So I think if you want to have a a sort of fair society and a tolerant society and all that kind of thing, then you want a lot of freedom for people, and you want people to be free to live the lives that they want to live. And crucially, I think you want people to be able to live those lives free from interference from government, from elsewhere, from prejudice, from discrimination, all of those kind of things which hold back people in our society and create that sense of inequality, the lack of fairness that we're grappling with as a society at the moment. And I think trying to build that more equal society and that freer society where people can be they can be whoever they want to be within our society. I think that is a fundamentally good thing, and something that I love about our country, that it is one of the freest societies in the world, that is somewhere where people can be the people they want to be, whether it's to do with their faith or their gender or sexual orientation or anything else. So I think that's really important, but I also want it to be a cohesive society. So I think it's really important that we have something that binds us together. And I think if you've got so many different faiths and beliefs and national identities and everything else, then I think you need to find something which can belong to everyone. And this idea of values, I think, is really, really important. And I think values underpin all of the decisions we make as individuals, as communities, as nations. Ultimately, if you look at anything that's happening in society, ultimately you can bring it back to the society's values, what they think are the most important things, the principles that they value most. And I was really struck coming to the Inclusion College, and you kindly sort of gathered some feedback from the students after the session that I ran, and one of them in the feedback had written, I watched the TV last night and it was all about what we were discussing in the session on British values. Because if you look at questions about, I don't know, the refugee crisis or teacher pay or anything else, ultimately it goes to our sense of values, of what we think is important, and the principles that we kind of value the most. So I think values are really important. Then I think then you have the opportunity to sort of explore what a democratic society is like. And as I said, you've got this kind of idea through these fundamental British values that you start with a notion of liberty, a notion of freedom, that people should be able to be free to be whoever they want to be, but there has to be some limit on that we have to be respectful to one another. We can't incite hate against one another, for example, or on a much more basic level, you can't drive 100 miles an hour outside the gates of a school because you might hit someone and hurt a child. And so we've got to have limits on that sort of liberty, and that's where rules and laws kind of come in. And when those rules clash, when your freedom of speech runs up against my freedom not to be experience prejudice or discrimination or whatever else, then I think you have to have democratic means to sort of sort that out. So you've got so values. I think this program of fundamental British values also just helps young people to understand what it is to have the building blocks in place for a well-functioning democracy. I think the last thing that I would say about this is, as you said in the introduction, this is about critical thinking as well. And I wouldn't sort of present Britain as a perfect democracy. And Britain isn't a perfect democracy. If you look at the international league tables, Britain doesn't come in the top 10 in terms of global sort of measures of democracy. So we've got a way to go. And I think encouraging young people to reflect on the society that they're growing up in, its strengths but also its weaknesses, is really key to helping them to grow up in Britain in the 21st century. So for all of those reasons, I think it's really, really important agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree, because and I think what you've touched on is that difference between teaching it as a statutory obligation, and sort of the knowledge and I guess the information and the definitions, versus certainly what you did when you came, and they're still asking when you're going to come back, by the way. It was to really think about about it, and you do run into this question of my values versus freedom of speech and this respect for each other, and then it was really interesting for them and for us, for all the staff as well, I think, to look at Britain, globally, like you said. That was a really, really good comparison, and to look at kind of different countries and their values and stuff. So the next point. So I did before the show, I did a poll on Twitter, because I really wanted to hear sort of the teacher's voice on this as well. So I asked, are there reservations amongst teachers and other educators with regards to teaching British values in school? And yeah, 63.6% said yes, they do have reservations. So I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. And look, I mean, that doesn't come as a complete surprise to me. Like I know, I know people are worried about this agenda. I think people are worried about this being something that's kind of come down from government rather than kind of come up from schools or from young people, from communities. And I think people are worried about that. I think they're worried about sort of forcing some kind of almost like jingoistic kind of like this is Britain, this is how great we are kind of view of the world on young people. I think they're worried about sort of claiming these sort of human values or democratic values as British values. So I get all of that. As I've said, I think it's I think you can do something really good with it, and I think your sort of your experience with my visit to the Inclusion College is kind of testament to that, and that's been an experience that I've had as I've gone around the country delivering this program at all ends of the country, and I think you can make it good, but you do have to address the concerns that teachers are raising, and perhaps I could go through those kind of concerns in turn, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Yes, that would
cool.
be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Well, so first, I mean, this kind of notion is this a kind of nationalistic kind of agenda? I think it's what you make of it. I think you can approach this in a really sort of critical way. So if you look at international comparisons on all of these fundamental British values, if you just take the data, um, you can see that Britain doesn't come on the top 10 in the top 10 of any of these values globally, or like the sort of living up to these values globally. And countries like Norway and Sweden and Denmark, New Zealand, come ahead of Britain on all of these measures in terms of liberty or the rule of law, democracy. So I'm not coming into classrooms around the country saying, "Look how perfect Britain is." I think it's really, really important to let young people sort of reflect on their own experience of growing up in Britain. Is this a tolerant and respectful country for people of different faiths and beliefs? Is this a free society? Is it a Do they feel it's a democratic society? And to get their sort of reflections on those questions. I think it's also important to introduce data as well, and to say Britain doesn't come in the top tens of any sort of global measures of these values, but it's always in the top 20, and that means that um, most countries in the world, most people in the world, don't live in countries which live up to these values the way that we do. Just on the sort of measure of democracy, I think Britain comes 18th on the global index of democracy. There's a kind of world league table of democracies, and Britain comes about 18th. But it's one of just 23 countries in the world which is considered to be a full democracy by the international experts who run the poll. And that means that fewer than 1 in 10 people in the world live in the kind of full democracy that we live in. So we're not perfect, but I think it's important to recognise that if democracy is something that you value, then we are lucky. Um, and I and as I talk about it, I don't think I sound jingoistic or nationalistic. I think I sound balanced and critical, and that's certainly what my intention is. So I think
Mm.
it's what you do with it is the most important thing. And
Ge-
on the sorry, Marie, go.
no, carry on.
And I think on this question of whether these values are kind of fundamentally British, uh, I've just said Britain doesn't come in the top 10 of any of the international measures or international league tables in relation to these values. So I don't think anyone could look at that data and argue that these values are sort of quintessentially or solely British. But I think what values really are not just who we are today, but the people that we want to be. You know,
Mm.
I go around the country talking about values, and I don't always live up to my values. No one does. No one's perfect. But I think values give you a sense of which way to go. They're like a compass pointing you in the right direction. And so I don't think of democracy and the rule of law and liberty and tolerance as solely or distinctly British values, but maybe they're the values that we should all aim towards. And that's what I tell young people, that I and their teachers and others in society want to work with them as the next generation to make this the most free society, the most democratic society, the most respectful society, the society in which we do have fairness and equality, and everyone's able to be the people that they want to be and live the lives that they want to live. But we all have to work towards that. So I don't think anyone would sort of sensibly claim that these are solely British values, but I understand it, or I interpret it as the values to which we're trying to live up to.
No, that's fantastic. So one of the comments I had actually
Mm,
from an assistant head was, by calling the values British, is that saying that other countries don't value these things? Are they not just human values? But I think what you've explained there is sort of answers that point. And a couple of things that you said, I think that it is important to acknowledge that we aren't perfect, because I think everyone will agree that when you talk to young people, their experiences aren't always of tolerance, and
mm,
respect, and being able to be who they are. So I think that's really important, because it gives them a voice as well, and that backing it up with the data as well is a really powerful way to acknowledge how young people in this country are feeling at the moment. But I really liked at the end. I just really liked what you said about it's who we want to be,
mm,
and I think you said a compass, and I was thinking it's more, it's a moral compass, isn't it? It's a
mm,
values-based compass, and quite empowering to think that you could, teach this, and then you've got, all these young people, the younger generation, who feel empowered to move towards the kind of society that you're talking about. I think if we just have another point before we head into the news.
mm.
So how do you avoid it becoming sort of nationalistic or exclusionary?
Um, well, I think you you've got to be sort of critical. I mean I think it's just approaching the subject like you would approach any other subject. I mean, teachers, I think, are really good at teaching impartially, neutrally. Not sort of um, taking a perspective or an agenda, introducing multiple agendas, giving a chance for young people to have their say, hearing from a wide range of different perspectives. I think it's just kind of good teaching. I should say that I was really pleased to sort of be advised on um, developing this program by colleagues I worked with through my career. As you said, I was at the Holocaust Educational Trust and at the PSHE Association, and I think sort of learning from that kind of best practice and taking that into kind of challenging a sort of vexed agenda, I think is really, really important thing. I think giving space for young people to give their perspective, I think is a really good way of ensuring that that this doesn't become a sort of a lecture or a kind of, you know, this is who we are in Britain. You must conform to this, you know, or you're not welcome. You're excluded, or whatever else. So I think that introducing young people's voice and making that a kind of core part of the program, I think, is really, really important. I think introducing the data is really, really important. I think exploring the values from a kind of critical perspective, I think, is really, really important, and being clear that all of these values have challenges kind of inherent in them. You know, when you talk about democracy, and you talk about the sort of value inherent in democracy, that, you know, the government should be by the people, for the people, that everyone should have a say over decisions that affect them, you can immediately introduce complexity into that and talk about the fact that the voting age is 18 in this country. You know, we've got local elections coming up this week, and young people in schools and colleges across the country won't have a say over the decisions which are going to affect them. And you can sort of take it to a kind of active citizenship model where you can get young people thinking about how we can get ourselves the vote, if that's something that they feel strongly about. And I think, again, that's a way of kind of flipping this agenda from being something which is sort of top down to being something which is actually used by young people to promote the causes that they care about. You know, if young people feel strongly about the votes at 16, then why not sort of launch a campaign saying, we learned about fundamental British values in school. One of these fundamental British values is about democracy, but we don't get a chance to have our say. And suddenly the agenda is turned on its head. And I know that teachers are worried about it being sort of exclusionary, or like not being open to everyone. But I do think that it's really important that we sort of show young people how this agenda can be used towards inclusion, whether that's democratic inclusion or anything else. And so I think if you practice sort of good teaching practice, good pedagogy, that you would on any other subject in PSHE or citizenship, then you can avoid this becoming a kind of nationalistic or exclusionary program, and something which is really, really inclusive, and not only really inclusive, but is that you can actively use to pursue further inclusion, which is all that I want to achieve.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Totally agree. And what you said about it not being top down, you know, but actually engaging young people and pupils to think about these values and what they mean to them, and what can be changed. You know, I think that's fantastic. Well, we're gonna go into the news now. You know, there's lots of lovely people listening online. I can see you on the chat. So if anyone wants to text in the show, please do. Otherwise, and we can look at those after the news. But otherwise, let's go into the news now. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Bri.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
ASCL is due to ballot members for the first time in its history. The 4 education unions will ballot over strike action this term, and, if backed by members, would see action stretching into next year and could lead to full school closures. The government continues to hold its position that the most recent pay offer is fair and reasonable, and that next year school funding will be at its highest level in history. Schools Week covers the further implications of school funding issues in a story about the cuts some head teachers are making. In a survey conducted by the National Foundation for Education Research for the Sutton Trust, it was found that schools are cutting back on school trips, teaching assistants and IT equipment to help balance stretched budgets. Responses from 1,428 primary and secondary teachers show 50% of senior leaders said their school had cut back on trips and outings this year. Schools in the most disadvantaged areas were most likely to be impacted by cuts to trips. The research suggests that in secondary schools, leaders are also cutting back on subject choices at both GCSE and A-level. The Department for Education has estimated schools overall could afford $2.4 billion in new spending between 2022 and 2024 before facing net pressure on their budgets. But the Confederation of School Trusts warned its members could face a prolonged period of financial challenge due to pay rises and other increasing costs if more funding was not forthcoming. The Sutton Trust's poll also showed that some school leaders are using pupil premium funding to plug budget gaps. The report also underlines the issue of recruitment into the sector, with the NFER predicting that the DFE will again miss its recruitment into initial teacher training target this year. Meanwhile, the TES focused on a DFE funding rule change to help schools hit by falling pupil numbers due to a decline in birth rate. Schools that are not rated good or outstanding will be eligible for additional funding. Other changes will be introduced from 2024 to 25, and councils will set expectations around the minimum funding they must provide to support schools with significant increases in pupil numbers. Schools with more than one site will also receive extra funding where they need to duplicate services over multiple sites. Falling birth rates mean there are projected to be 500,000 fewer pupils in English state nurseries and primaries in 2028 compared with 2022. Nurseryworld.co.uk reports on the findings of its recent survey into staff wellbeing around Ofsted inspections. In the article on its website, it reports that over 3,000 owners, managers and staff responded to questions around mental health and wellbeing and the impact of inspections. Many responded that they felt increased stress and anxiety in the run-up to an inspection, with many having sleepless nights and some suffering from panic attacks and depression. The possibility of losing funding, should a setting be judged inadequate, was also mentioned. Full details of the survey can be found on the Nursery World website. The Guardian reports that a record figure of £4.8 billion interest has been added to student debt in Britain last year. The government has more than doubled the amount of money it makes from charging interest on student loans, as graduates face borrowing costs of almost twice the rate set by the Bank of England. The Office for National Statistics said the accrued interest had doubled from £2.3 billion in the previous year. The forecast average debt among the cohort of students who started their course in 2021 and 22 is £45,800 when they complete their course. Finally, the Morning Star in Scotland reports that increased spending per school pupil is failing to deliver improved outcomes. Spending per pupil has risen to £8,500 in Scotland, compared with around £7,200 across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But attainment in Scotland is not on a similarly rising trajectory. Research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows that despite having the highest spending per pupil across the UK for a long period, test scores in reading, maths and science have either stayed the same or have been going down. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to attempt to explain in simple terms how the internet works. Let's take this tech briefing for example. I know every single one of you at some point have thought, how on earth can someone who makes a recording in one part of the world be broadcast globally to thousands of people and there be very few errors? I won't even go off when you go under a bridge, although I did give Tom Rogers a lift once and can tell you he's so radio he stopped talking when I drove through the Mersey Tunnel. For the internet to work, a way of allowing people to simultaneously use the same cables had to be created. The traditional phone call method could not be used because this would limit the number of users. If computers made a dedicated connection like a phone call does, then there'd be a lot of waiting going on. Imagine if you had to wait in line for a download. You are 457th in the queue. Your download is important to us. Please listen to this monotonous music while you wait. It simply wouldn't catch on. So, what happens? Data is transmitted in a similar way to the postal system, just a lot quicker. Right now, this podcast is arriving on your device in a series of packets. Packets are really small chunks of data that can be sent from device to device via routers. Without getting too geeky on you, the host server gets a request from you when you press play. The request says, start sending me the packets of the audio chocolate you know as Steve Woods' tech briefing. And like chocolate, it's split into chunks. These chunks are given an address to get to, an address of where they came from, some other information like the type of file being sent, so your device knows which application to open it in, and a number, so the packets can be ordered and rebuilt when they arrive. These packets are directed over the internet by routers that use the address information to direct them, and then rebuilt by your device once they arrive. Because packets are so small and can be forwarded rapidly, lots of computers can send data at the same time and keep everybody connected. So next time you're using the internet, consider that what you're looking at has probably been split into thousands of packets, routed across the world, and being rebuilt in a matter of milliseconds for you to enjoy. As always, if you have a tech question, why not send it to @TTRadioOfficial. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Okay, and welcome back. So, Joe, we have had a question through, which I hope you're okay for me to ask.
Yep.
So, the recommendations that are in use, so the government guidance on promoting British values in schools, someone has said, I think this should be a starting point of the discussion, as it's now close to a decade since it was released.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd love to see the values kind of updated and have a discussion about that. I think as we sort of touched on before the break, I think there are some values which are kind of not explicit in the list that the government gives us at the moment. So fairness and equality were a couple that I drew upon. I think fairness and equality are sort of inherent in ideas of the rule of law and democracy, but I think a lot of people would want to see them more explicit in the list of values. I also think it would be a really interesting conversation to have with young people. I hope I'm not doing anyone a disservice, but I certainly don't remember in 2014 there being a huge kind of consultation or conversation with young people about what the kind of values that schools should be teaching about should be, and I think that would be a really interesting process. Indeed, when I'm working with young people, that's a really interesting question that I explore with them, and I think it's a great exercise. If you were writing the fundamental British values that all young people should learn about, what would be on the list and why? I think that's a great sort of question for exploration. And I do think that there are some issues with the values as they're currently written. I think there's a lot of people who are troubled by this kind of notion of tolerance, this notion that we just it feels a bit sort of passive, a bit like we just put up with one another, and it doesn't speak to the kind of cohesive, multicultural, respectful society that we want to build. And suddenly we're just putting up with people who are different from us, and perhaps we're like ships passing in the night. I think there are times where we do just have to put up with people who have different views from us. I think, there are people who I encounter who take much more sort of nationalistic views on the world, for example, than the ones that I've expressed. And sometimes there are people that we do disagree with. And I do think if we were exploring this kind of notion of mutual tolerance and respect, that we might want to add in something there about challenging people if they are being prejudiced or racist or xenophobic or anything else, that there may be limits to our tolerance and respect. We shouldn't be tolerant of intolerance or respectful of people being disrespectful. So I think there's a lot to unpack and to explore. I think it would be a great exercise, and I think just because the guidance hasn't been updated by government doesn't mean that schools in their own programs can't explore questions like whether there should be a notion of challenge and in this definition of tolerance and respect, or where fairness and equality kind of fit in. So I would take the guidance as a starting point and build upon it. And I should say, I'm always very happy to help schools to sort of build upon their statutory obligations and turn the program into something that's really sort of nuanced and builds critical thinking and so on. But yeah, I'd love to see the values updated.
Oh, thank you. That's a great answer. I think that point that you can take the statutory obligation, but that's not the end of it. You can,
Yeah.
I mean, you can build your own. You could build your own school values into it, for example, couldn't you? And then that sort of thing. No, that's really good. And I remember when we did talk about tolerance. And yeah, the way you explained it, that's very interesting. I think are we just tolerating? I love the idea of having challenge in there, and I think it just made me think sort of the other way as well. Are we just tolerating other people who, within this diverse society that we have, or can we celebrate? Obviously that's now getting a bit wordy if we're going to tolerate, respect, challenge, and celebrate. But I think I agree with what you're saying. Tolerating or tolerance does sound quite passive. So yeah, perhaps very interesting point, and I'm sure that I'm going to take that into college. I know I will, and talk to them about what values would you have if you had free rein to rewrite it, the guidance. What would you put? Because it'd be very interesting to hear their views. No, thank you for that, for answering that.
Maybe I can come and join that discussion as well.
Yes, please. Yes, there we go. We've got a visit planned.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you for answering someone's question. Right. So going back to this, here's a question: is the notion of Britishness relevant in a globalized world?
So you probably expect me to say yes, given that I run this organisation, Learn About Britain. I think I come from a starting point that we're all human beings, and I've been really lucky in my life to be able to travel around the world and meet people from all over the world, and hugely value that. I also feel incredibly fortunate to live in a city, London, where the world comes to this city as well. So I'm a passionate believer in notions of universal human rights and different cultures and everything else. I think nations are still the primary way that we organize ourselves as people, and maybe one day it won't be like that, but for now it is. And when we make decisions as groups, the primary way that we do that in relation to taxation or foreign policy, of which, even whether we go to war with other countries, we do it as nations. And therefore, I think it's really important from my perspective, that there is some sense of what binds us as a nation. I think if you don't have that, then I think you risk having atomization, division, a sort of polarization, alienation, some of the things that can sort of tear people apart or pit people against one another, and that's not the society that I want to be part of. This for me comes back to a sort of agenda that I have, that is about trying to build a fair, equal, cohesive society, and those ideas may sometimes sort of pull against one another as we sort of compete for equal rights, or we challenge where people have held prejudiced views. I think it's really important that we also remind ourselves of the things that we have in common, the things that we share, or at least the values to which we aspire. And when I say we, there are different we's. There are we's of us as human beings. There are we's of us in our families, but I think the we I'm talking about is us as a sort of British people. And until that's, as long as nations exist, and as long as countries like Britain exist, I think having some sense of what we have in common with one another is really, really vital.
Yeah, agreed. So how does the debate about British history play into this? Because many schools are grappling with that issue at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I think again the same sort of principles apply. I think where I would end a program with young people about fundamental British values would be to talk about the fact that Britain doesn't come in the top 10 of any of the international measures as we kind of talked about, and then to pose the question, well, if these fundamental British values are not quintessentially or solely British, what is it that makes us British? What is it that we have in common, if anything? And as I said earlier, I want to make sure that our conversation isn't just about a kind of legal citizenship definition, which is simply we're all technically legal citizens of the same country, the same sort of legal entity. That doesn't feel to me like a recipe for a cohesive society. And I think there is more to Britishness than that. I think there's our geography, there's our culture, there's the future to which we're building. But there is this question of our history as well. And I know, as you say, that that's something that the schools are grappling with. As with the sort of the education about fundamental British values, I think it's really important that that is nuanced, that it's critical, that it's fair, that it doesn't come with a kind of a slant where you're looking for the history to suit your agenda. I think education is the pursuit of truth, a sort of never-ending pursuit of truth, because I know from working in education my whole career that the way people view history changes and develops, and more sources come to light and more perspectives come to the fore. But I think it's critical that young people growing up in this country learn about the country's history. I think it's really, really important that is balanced and fair, that it doesn't come with an agenda attached to it, a sort of political agenda where the history is being cherry picked to meet that agenda. And I think that helps us to explain and understand who we are. And I think history is absolutely vital in that respect. But as I said earlier, I think this is fundamentally about good teaching, and I think a good history teacher, whatever their own sort of personal view of the world, will take a historical subject and apply best practice pedagogy to it, look at it dispassionately, encourage discussion and debate. And I think that's what we should do in relation to our history, and be open to the fact that there are things in our history that the country's done badly, that have been wrong, that have been counter to those fundamental values that I talked about earlier on. But also to recognise that there have been great things that the country has done as well. I've written about. You mentioned one of my books, or you mentioned my books, and in one of those I went to Northern Ireland and looked a bit into Bloody Sunday and the terrible things that happened there, and that is something, an episode, a moment, something that happened for which the British government has apologised and said was wrong. And I think a confident nation, a secure nation, is able to confront the things that it's done badly in its history, the mistakes that it's made. As we also discussed, one of my previous roles was managing director of the Holocaust Educational Trust, and I had the privilege of visiting the museum and memorial at Bergen-Belsen, which was the concentration camp which the British Army liberated, where Jewish lives were saved, and the eradication of a people, a genocide, was stopped in part by Britain, and that is something that I feel proud of, and that is a good thing. So I think if we're happy to be both critical and proud at the same time, to go with it wherever the information takes us, then I think we can develop a really good program for young people about our nation's history. And with that in mind, if you forgive me a little plug, we're currently advertising for a head of British history at Learn About Britain, someone to come in and develop a curriculum, a program for schools that schools can deliver and that we can deliver in schools, that sort of aspires to exactly that kind of fairness and neutrality, that's kind of openness to exploring British history and searching for the truth that I've just talked about. So if anyone listening is a history teacher or knows a history teacher who'd be interested in applying, please do go to learnaboutbritain.uk and you can see all about the role.
I mean, what a fascinating role. I loved a lot of what you've said there. I think that, that ability to look at it dispassionately, I think you said, using, using teaching history to look at things that we can be proud of in our history, but also things that, aren't as positive or even mistakes in our history. But I think it's a thing, and I always think when we teach about the Holocaust and recognizing Holocaust Memorial Day and things, that's a very good example. I feel strongly that you need to teach these things to prevent it happening again. If we sort of brush over things in our history as a nation that weren't good, how are we challenging them in the future? Going back to that word challenge, I absolutely loved the phrase that you used, though, that education is a never-ending pursuit of the truth. I just think that's a fantastic phrase. Okay, right, so much in that, and and it's just been so interesting. I think so. I'm looking at the time because we could talk about this a lot. Like you said, talk about these British values.
I could talk about it
any
all day.
Yeah. So I think to round up a bit, the things that have really struck me is number one, for those teachers out there that are worried or concerned or struggling to deliver this, I think the point that you made of, yes, there's the statutory obligation, but that's not the end of it. You can expand on it. It's not a tick box exercise. It's about giving young people the time to learn our history, learn about Britain. Yes, to learn and consider these values, the individual liberty and the mutual respect and tolerance, the rule of law and democracy, but really going on to think about the other ones that you've mentioned, that fairness and equality, and how does it work when some of these values clash or sort of impede on each other. I think everything that you've said about sort of encouraging those discussions, acknowledging that we aren't perfect, but that moral compass to move towards who we want to be as a country, as a nation. And that's got to come, I feel, that's got to come from young people, as how their experiences, listening to their experiences, listening to their views, and then educating them on thinking about these values and what they mean in their life. It's been so fantastic, Joe. We have got a few more minutes, so I just wondered if you got any sort of closing thoughts or anything that you want to share as we come to the end.
Yeah, well, as I say, Marie, I could talk about this all day. So you just tell me when to shut up. But I mean, I think for teachers, I understand why people are worried about these kind of agendas, and I share some of their reservations. I think if you apply really good teaching practice, then I don't think you need to have a problem. I think on British history or British values, or on any other part of the curriculum, the statutory obligation is always the starting point. The schools never just teach exactly what's on the piece of paper from government, which is often a single bullet point, a few words. It's dry. A teacher's job is to bring those obligations to life, and I think teachers do a fantastic job of that. I do know of schools where they ask young people to learn the British values by rote, just to learn them off by heart, so that if anyone ever asked them, they'd know what the values are. But learning by rote doesn't tell you what they mean. And there is something, you can go so much deeper here, and I've written two books about Britain. I'm interested in the country. I've learned about Britain. But even if you just put Britain to one side, I think you can learn about the building blocks of a functioning democracy. The idea that you have freedom, that you want everyone to be free to be whoever they want to be, but then you have to put some constraints about that, about being tolerant and respectful of other people, and that you should have rules and laws and democratic means if one person's freedoms clashes with another person's freedoms, and you use democracy to work that out. That is, for me, the recipe for a pluralist, multicultural, cohesive democracy. So that's really good learning, and you can build critical thinking. I should have said earlier, you build great oracy skills as well by having these discussions. And what's great is that you can talk about these things and young people are interested in them. And that means that they get a chance to talk. So you build really good oracy skills while you do it. And similarly on history, I think good teaching practice, that pursuit of truth that we talked about, and that notion of it being never ending, the notion that no one has a monopoly on what British history is, and no one has a monopoly on British values either. I think we're all sort of learning together and exploring together, and that for me is what good teaching is all about. But I recognize that it is difficult, it is challenging for teachers, and that's why I set up Learn About Britain, because I want to provide people with support to do it really, really well. If we're going to do it, let's do it well. Let's not just learn the values off by heart, so that if an Ofsted inspector comes in, the pupils can recite them. And let's not learn about our history through a lens which says we want to say everything's great or we want to say everything's terrible. Let's take balanced, nuanced learning that we take in every other subject into learning about Britain's history, citizenship, culture, and values. And for me, that's what Learn About Britain's all about. So if anyone listening, if we can help anyone who's listening, please do get in touch. My email is joe@learnaboutbritain.uk, and I'd love to hear from people.
Lovely, thank you so much. I mean, what a very powerful conclusion, I think. If we're going to do it, let's do it well. And I guess the message is, don't be scared. Don't be scared to do it. It's an extremely valuable topic, and goes beyond the Ofsted tick list. Of learning these values by rote. Joe, it's been absolutely amazing to discuss this morning, and like I said, I really, really appreciate you giving up your bank holiday Monday. We'll end there, and you can go off and enjoy your day. Thank you everyone that's listened and answered the poll and sent in texts and questions, because that's so I really appreciate that as well. And Joe, I will talk to you soon, but thank you ever so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marie, and thanks to all who are listening.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Cheers.
Bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.